okay. But we are on time, and really enjoyed the first two sessions, and I think we've got a good panel right now. My name is Reed Kramer. I direct our asset building program at the New America Foundation. And really, I'd also just take this moment to thank all my colleagues who have helped organize and put on this event. It's really been a team effort, and I hope they've treated you well and gotten you all here. And we are going to have some lunch available for you when this panel closes. And I'll thank all of you for joining us as well. One of the main themes that we intended to highlight today was how the experience of the Great Recession really raises fundamental questions about how we choose to organize and structure our economy, and then codify, informally or formally, the social contract. And among the many objectives for economic policy is to make sure that it aligns with our social policy. If the economy is to grow responsibly and sustainably, we need to fully engage a productive workforce. We also need to provide social insurance protections that can kick in during times of economic turmoil. So when prosperity returns to the economy, we have to ensure and take the necessary steps so that benefits are widely shared. And in the run-up to the election, we had an extended period where productivity gains were captured by incomes at the very top. Wealth inequality grew to even greater degrees, and many families ended up filling this gap with increased levels of debt. Now, I'd also say before we look forward too eagerly, it's important to recognize that the Great Recession is continuing to really leave a debilitating wake. Families are still coping with job loss, wealth erosion, rising foreclosures. It's happening right now. It's happening all across the country. Really new areas, new sources of economic insecurity are emerging, and hardship is spreading quite widely. It's impacting individuals, it's impacting families, and it's impacting entire communities. So when we think about crafting an appropriate response, and really necessitates revisiting some of these prevailing policy assumptions to see which ones need to be discarded, which ones need to be added, and which ones need to be refined. And this panel is going to focus on the issues of savings, access to credit, and home ownership. Traditionally, these were some of the essential elements, the foundations of economic security and the entire asset building process. There's substantial evidence that the way families move up the proverbial economic ladder is through accessing a combination of income and assets. This is how families live. This is why they need to earn, they need to save, and they need to invest in their future. It's how they maintain economic security. It's how they exert kind of a direct stake in the commonwealth, in their communities, and it's how they pursue their aspirations. So one of our outstanding critiques of the existing framework is how current policy fails to create sufficient pathways, especially for those families at the bottom with fewer resources, with lower incomes, to move forward in their lives. And we can look at some of the current policies that skew benefits upward towards those with higher incomes. We look at the homeowners deduction. We look at some of the tax preferences for people that make contributions to tax-preferred accounts, retirement accounts. These all distribute benefits to the middle and the upper income scale. Another problem is that savings and assets for many families were poorly secured, and they were often imbalanced. So when we had the housing bubble merge and pop, and we had irresponsible lending, it certainly revealed the limits of a home ownership model for many families who had the majority of their assets held up in housing equity. Others, of course, saw their investments erode when the stock market fell. This affected their retirement savings. This was particularly a problem for families that were already over-leveraged by excessive debt levels. It's obviously creating some real problems that need to be addressed. We're obviously in a deleveraging moment here for many households who were able to access credit quite easily over the recent period. Now, I would say that the proliferation of credit, has been a little bit of a double-edged sword. It did create opportunities for a number of families, but a lot of families at the low end were accessing very high-cost and low-quality financial products in the world of check cashers and payday lenders, this unregulated fringe economy, and it caught many families in a debt trap that they're having a hard time getting out of. And another component was certainly the way mortgages were delivered, often without sufficient consideration to whether they were repaid at all. And this is really a remarkable development, one that really we can't repeat in the future. So as we revisit some of these policy assumptions and market practices, I think we do need to acknowledge the essential role that social insurance plays. Certainly, we need to activate it when the economy delivers uncertainty. As has been mentioned previously, food stamps, unemployment insurance, TANF, these programs have been doing a lot of heavy lifting right now, and likely will need to do more in the future. But for me, the asset building model still holds a lot of promise. It makes a great deal of sense because of the way families need to access resources that can be built up, that can be managed, that then can be deployed over time. Not a replacement for social insurance, but a necessary component to promoting long-term social development. And this is because risk is everywhere. It's real and it's pervasive. And the social contract between families, government actors, market forces really needs to be designed to mitigate risks that have been exposed by the Great Recession. And it's a primary role of policy to offer a set of tools to help families mitigate risks. So those tools can take many forms. That's what we're going to talk about today. They can take the form of consumer protection around financial products to make sure that people are accessing products that are appropriate to their circumstance. I think there should be opportunities to save with the right default mechanism so it happens automatically even when people aren't paying attention, thinking of the way that people generally save through their employer, through their work, through their retirement account contributions. And this is increasingly important as we switch to this defined benefit scheme. If that's going to be the one that we settle on, we need to make sure that everyone's participating and that they're contributing at levels that give them access to the right expected outcomes down the road. And this is in addition to strengthening the Social Security framework. Another key is to establish that the incentives, we get them right, that they promote responsible behavior, both by financial providers and by households. This is a process that's unfolding. We can look at it in terms of homeownership, but we really should be thinking about describing and identifying what responsible homeownership looks like in today's world and in the years ahead. But certainly the landscape is changing. The advent of the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau should really help reshape the terrain. We're also going to be approaching this public discussion around reforming the housing finance system. And I think that's going to be a very consequential discussion. It's one that's on deck. And the details of this are going to matter a great deal. But as we approach that discussion, we really do need to learn from recent experience to identify the kinds of principles for action going forward. So this panel is going to help us dig into these questions around savings, credit, and homeownership, how we think about consumer protection, how we think about reforming the housing finance system, helping families mitigate risk, and also promoting economic mobility and asset building. So I'm joined here by Jonathan Mintz, Mike Conzel, Sarah Rosen-Wartell, a real impressive group. Their extended bios are in your packages, but I think you'll all see they're really worth a close listen to. Jonathan is Commissioner of the Department of Consumer Affairs in the city of New York, where he not only oversees consumer protection issues broadly, but he's really been a leading innovator in designing initiatives to educate, empower, and protect low-income families as they manage their financial resources. He's done some great work, innovative projects that we're learning from and that are becoming models for other cities and actors. Mike is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and author of a Reutebaum blog, which I always like to mention because it's kind of unique, and He's a great writer, but he comes out of the financial sector, so he's been able to kind of give some real insights into the connection between how people are accessing financial services, the structure of the financial sector, and his blog's really been a go-to site, at least for a bunch of people that I talk with, for a lot of information, translating it into real accessible language. So pleased to have him. And then Sarah Rosen-Wortel is Executive Vice President of the Center for American Progress. She's been a leading light in thinking about how social policy can benefit working families. I first met her when she was a major force in the Clinton White House in the National Economic Council, and before that had done some real important work at HUD. But recently she's led a working group on, focused on financial, reforming the housing finance system. My colleague Ellen Seidman participated with her on that, and I expect some of the findings of this group to really drive some of the discussions going forward and the upcoming debates. So each of them is going to offer their perspectives on the questions in play, and then we're going to have some time for a nice exchange. Thanks. Jonathan.
This comes as a real relief to me. I apparently was the only one on the panel who had been told this was going to be a musical. I think you're all in for a treat because I'm just going to do it prose. I'm really excited actually about the opportunity to step back and talk about revised assumptions. I think that it is always a tremendous pivot point opportunity for policymakers when those assumptions can be re-examined and when new opportunities can be seized on. When I think about the assumptions to be revised over the last few years, I come up with 4 of them. This is the music. Right. The first is I think that the risks of inadequate consumer protection in the financial services industry are no longer apocryphal. Now, to those of us in the room, that old assumption being trashed may not be much of a surprise, and I think we all know that it will only stay in all of our collective memories for so long. But I do think that the first assumption is that those risks are quite real. The second assumption that I want to come back to is that low and middle income families really will respond to financial empowerment initiatives. In other words, that crisis management doesn't have to be the ceiling with which you engage with those of low and middle incomes. The third assumption I want to hit on is that I think we can revise the way we take a look at financial institutions. This may not be hugely popular to say at the moment, but working with financial institutions really does not have to be a zero-sum game. And then the fourth assumption I want to talk about, and maybe this is the one audience I can say it in and not get laughed at, is that I think the federal government actually can be nimble. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. So let's go to my first revised assumption, which is that the risks that people talk about when you have an unsound consumer financial marketplace can be quite real. No longer are you just hearing that from NGOs and consumer advocates making dire predictions, but in fact, in many ways, the sky did fall. And it fell in a way that mattered to policymakers in part because as it fell around those with low and middle incomes, the ripple effects through neighborhoods and local, state, and national economies was fast-forwarded for all of our view and was so obvious. Just a few facts that I would throw in there for reference. Again, I know that none of you need to be convinced of this. First of all, just a couple of poverty numbers. In 2 years, America has moved from 1 in 7 people being under the poverty line from 1 in 8. That's a massive change over the space of a couple of years. According to the Census Bureau, we now have the highest number of those considered in poverty since they've been counting, over 51 years. Foreclosure data. This number, people keep putting in my speech, and I keep refusing to read it because I can't believe it's true. But apparently, at this point, in the last quarter, 1 in every 139 homes went into foreclosure. The numbers are staggering. Credit scores. 25% of consumers, over a quarter of consumers, had credit scores in April that was below the magic number of 600. That's a quarter of American consumers. Historically, that number has always hovered around 15%. So the damage that's been done in that sector, is quite apparent. And as I say, no longer just the concern of those who make it their business to worry about and try to help those with lower and middle incomes. The second assumption is one that is really born out of the work that we've been fortunate enough to do in New York and that's been done through so many other localities. We have a coalition called the Cities for Financial Empowerment where we've seen a lot of these programs as well. And this assumption is that those with even very low incomes are interested in and capable of participating in asset building, not just crisis management. The old assumptions in this category that really come to my mind, first and foremost, is that financial education was a snooze and that asset building was only a luxury. We have found in our work and the work of our colleagues that really isn't true. For example, in New York, we developed something called a Financial Empowerment Center system. We now have over 20 centers across the city where we are providing one-on-one professional financial counseling. The idea being relatively obvious, which is that when things are complicated, even a fabulous website or a great brochure or a terrific class really aren't going to do it. And you're not only not necessarily going to draw the people that could use the services, but you're not going to help them translate decent information into genuine relief. What's exciting for us about our financial empowerment centers is not just that we think we've discovered the key to demand. Our counselors across the network are booked 2 and 3 weeks out, which for those of you in the social service world can be tough to get that kind of people showing up. But we are actually tracking whether or not that kind of counseling, which we're doing at a scale across a city the size of New York, can be measured in ways that make a difference so that we can move forward with policymakers and say, if you provide these kinds of services, you can see the kinds of results that we're seeing in New York. So for example, we've just completed, we're at around, I think it's in the last year or so, about 13,000 sessions that we've done. We have counted up, for example, the debt reductions of our clients, in part because our counselors are literally picking up the phone and showing them how do you negotiate with a creditor. That amount is hovering close to $3 million in the last year. And as you can imagine, that's a lot of small credit amounts adding up. In addition, we're able to quantify savings for those who came into these centers either first or then secondarily to start to build savings for their futures. In addition, we are able to pull credit scores. So we are actually tracking how many clients are improving their credit scores. Now, all of this might sound relatively standard, but the truth is in financial education, that's almost never been done before. Few have ever really pushed themselves or been pushed by policymakers or funders to quantify results as opposed to merely count the people coming in the door and hope that the information is somehow being absorbed. So that really can be done, and I would argue should be done. The next generation with this assumption for us is inserting this kind of professional one-on-one counseling into other, what I would refer to as mainstream anti-poverty initiatives to see whether or not we can prove that that kind of work genuinely improves the initial anti-poverty work. So for example, we just received state funding to weave counseling into foreclosure prevention. So one of the things that we all know, and it's sort of this horrible secret about foreclosure prevention work, is that even if you're lucky enough to get a client to navigate all the way to a modification, some 2/3 of them fail within a few months again. So figuring out the rest of the financial picture, we think can make a genuine difference. In addition, I want to talk a little bit about a savings program called Save NYC, which is now being replicated thanks to the President's Social Innovation Fund into something called the Save USA, where we are using tax time as a moment to spin off part of this EITC credit and figuring out whether or not, in fact, people will be willing to try to save that money. We use private dollars to match them if they succeed in doing so after a year. The results have been startling. In an incredibly expensive city with an average income of some $17,000, we had 80% of those who tried to save this money succeed in saving it for a year, and 50% of them continue to do it again. So again, this work can be done. You can engage those in crisis in the middle of a terrible economy in ways that are about building their future. The third assumption is working with financial institutions doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Not a hugely political popular thing to say, at least outside of New York, but there are true win-win-win points on the Venn diagram of these partnerships. It doesn't all have to be about regulation. Now, I say that in part because as a city, I don't have the power to regulate the banks, and so we had to figure out something a little bit more hopeful. But we have found that one can, in fact, engage financial institutions beyond the traditional CRA kind of philanthropic mentality to identify, and in our case, identify safe products that can, in fact, be made available to targeted populations. Banks are willing to do it under the right circumstances, and the key is to identify that winning moment. The final assumption I wanted to point out is that federal government can be nimble. The list is unbelievable of what's been happening in Washington: credit card reform, CRA reform, new overdraft rules, FDIC template accounts. It goes on and on and on. And of course, most importantly, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I just want to say three things about the incredible promise of what I think the CFPB can bring moving forward and being mindful of these revised assumptions about what can be accomplished. First of all, of course, you need effective disclosures for meaningful choice. That's what we need to be looking for here. Second of all, and this has to go hand in hand, there has to be meaningful enforcement so that there is a level playing field and the disclosures and the transparency that the CFPB and its partners in federal government can require will have consequences around those who aren't participating. And then finally, I think there's education. The businesses need to know as much as consumers do how you navigate that information in order to make smart policy choices. The story of the CFPB is being written as we speak and as we sit here. I think the early indicators to look for are whether or not you're going to see the facilitation of better transactions in their regulatory structure as opposed to simply curtailing problematic practices. I think that would be a very encouraging sign. Our consumer complaints informing enforcement and examination priorities rather than just generating data. One of the ways to really be nimble is to be on top of what's happening. And then finally is the Bureau leveraging partnerships rather than simply relying on regulation. I think these are the keys that play off what we're learning in today's economy. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
What does a financial sector do? Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, excellent. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here. I'd like to thank Reed for inviting me, and I'd like to thank New America for hosting this. And I'd like to ask you again, what does a financial sector do? Since about 2 years ago, when you may have woke up one morning to learn Lehman Brothers was collapsing, and this was something you had to urgently know about, you've probably learned all kinds of arcane things about the financial sector. Securitized tranches of mortgages, derivatives clearinghouses, all kinds of other things you prefer to be doing other things with your time. You've had to learn about them, but often we haven't stepped back and said, what does our financial sector do? And it does two things, two primary things that we're going to focus on here. One is that it's a medium of exchange. It's a way of linking buyers and sellers. And there's all kinds of mechanisms that does this. We have cash, we have checks, we have credit cards, we have debit cards, we have money orders, all kinds of mechanisms that essentially function as an exchange between two willing individuals who want to buy and sell something. The other thing it does is it's a matching system for investors and for borrowers, for lenders and for borrowers. It's a means of taking money that you have not consumed and doing something with it, rather than just putting it in your mattress. It allows people who want to open businesses to borrow at some rate and put that money to use growing the economy. So when you think about a financial system as both a medium of exchange and a matching system, we should think of it as essentially a system that should bring together two parties that ultimately want to negotiate with each other. Now, over the past 30 years, we've seen a large increase in both the size, the scope, and the complexity of the financial system. There's a lot of ways to approach this. I'm going to approach this from a consumer's point of view and both learn, and as this whole arrangement is to revise our policy assumptions, I'm going to say, what have been the policy assumptions of the past 30 years, and what should they be going forward? The policy assumptions of the past 30 years regarding the financial sector have been largely hands-off, largely deregulation written by and for large financial institutions. We saw this in the late 90s with some of the debates about derivatives. The purpose of the government in regulating the financial sector, as envisioned at that time, was to protect naive investors. It was to make sure that people could put some money in their checking and savings account without subjecting it to bank runs. It was to make sure that, someone couldn't necessarily lie to you on a credit card application or a mortgage application, but that sophisticated investors, the people at the Wall Street banks, the people who were buying mortgage-backed securities, could largely be left to their own devices because through their own incentives, through their own sophistication, they would naturally create a market that worked best. We are living in the aftermath of those failed assumptions. What I want to argue for you today, and we're not going to get through all these points, but I want you to keep them in mind, is that our financial sector has taken on 5 traits that are worrisome. One is concentration. By any measure, the financial sector is more concentrated across all boundaries than it's ever been before, both in size and both in scope. We saw this was a deliberate policy initiative. The deregulation of state banking laws, the deregulation of banking lines, cultivating and Graham-Leach Biley, which allowed the creation of Citigroup through absorbing insurance companies. It's regressive. We see this with credit cards. We see this with the ways that the banking system, as it applies for consumers, has poor people paying more to allow rich people to fly for free with frequent flyer miles. This is, if you talk to, many of the modern credit card innovators from the early 80s will say this out loud. So it's a system that, as a medium of exchange, is biased towards some people and away from other people, often away from our most vulnerable and towards those who already have the most. It's riskier. This is a brand new system, and we haven't really put it through a stress test up until now, and it's failing in very predictable ways. It's lacking accountability to either end of the medium, either investors or borrowers. If you look at the mortgage and the foreclosure situation we have right now, nobody's happy. We could justify large foreclosures maybe if investors were really happy about the situation, but they're not. In fact, we'll talk about this in a second. They're suing in large numbers, the servicers in the Bank of America, or servicers and many of the large financial institutions are supposed to be monitoring this. So it's not clear that it's accountable to either end of the exchange, that it is primarily set up to moderate. And last is that it's become primarily concerned with its own profits. We see this in the banking sector from the large expansion of proprietary trading, which is financial institutions using their own money for their own bets, using the information they see as the medium of exchange. And we also see it in a lot of other ways where there's an increase in skimming off what should be essentially a public utility model that links to people whose interactions are essential for our economy. And I have limited time, so I'm going to kind of speed through this a little bit, but I want to talk about those 5 conceptions of what has gone wrong with our financial sector in 2 parts. One is the foreclosure crisis, the foreclosure fraud crisis, if I may be direct, something that if you haven't heard about, you'll hear about more in the next couple months. And the second is a little known but quite vicious battle over an amendment in the Senate, the Durbin Interchange Reform, which reformed the way credit card fees are charged to retail businesses. It's an interesting story, and it tells something about the stakes and about what's gone wrong. So foreclosure crisis. Foreclosure numbers are bad. I mean, they're bad by any account, and they're surprisingly bad because a foreclosure is fundamentally a lose-lose-lose situation. It's bad for homeowners. Homeowners can usually pay some price to stay in their home that's above the recovery value of the home. It's bad for investors. Investors end up with a property that they never wanted that they sell at foreclosures at huge discounts, 30, 40% in good times, in some territories 70% right now. Usually there's a difference. If your home is worth $100,000 but your mortgage is $150,000, you could probably pay it at $120,000. If the bank forecloses it, they have to sell it for $70,000 or at a best case $100,000. So there is some mechanism that they should be able to intermediate, and they should find a mechanism to negotiate that debt. If you look at the Texas oil bubble of the mid-'80s, 86 is when it popped, it had a housing bubble with it. Foreclosures never topped 2%. We were beating that late 2008 as a nation. And the third lose, it's bad for communities. Huge spillover effects, devastates neighborhoods. You have properties that sit abandoned, it tracks crime, devastates local municipality budgets. You know, an estimate by the Urban Institute says that for every abandoned property neighborhood, that costs a municipality $20,000. So 3 foreclosures that are abandoned is a teacher's salary. It's one of the most ugly forms of a backdoor bailout we have going on right now. So with that in mind, why is this happening? Well, it's happening because we've created a brand new system of having accountability in the mortgage markets. Mortgage-backed securities are not your George Bailey Bank. You do not go and meet someone and shake their hand and renegotiate your mortgage if times get tough. What you have is a servicer model. You have a servicer model that, I'm not at 2 minutes, okay, sorry. You have a model of where the banks make the most money where things go bad. They sit in the middle, and they're supposed to take money. It's supposed to be a very streamlined business. They're supposed to take money in one door from the homeowner, walk it out the back door to the waterfall structure in the mortgage-backed security. Now, what happens is that they get paid extra when things go bad. So what happens when things go bad? Well, it's kind of like a credit card system. The ideal consumer from their point of view is someone who's always just a little bit late making payments, because extra payments go to the middlemen there. And we see this. There's a study that a lot of people have sort of replicated this, but the best we've seen was just a month ago from the Federal Reserve Board of Atlanta that found that, in general, servicers aren't negotiating any bad debts, but when they're ultimately responsible for it, when it's on their books and instead of when it's with a school board in Wisconsin or a pension fund in Denmark, they're much better. They're much more on the ball with renegotiating this debt and getting it current. It's no surprise. So why has this happened? Well, it's happened for a variety of reasons. One part is because we don't have the normal fail-safe mechanism of bankruptcy. The ultimate form of consumer protection will always be our bankruptcy courts. If you look in the Constitution, the states have the right to make bankruptcy courts. The founders were well aware of these problems that existed. But due to a quirk in the way the bankruptcy courts were set up in the 70s, 2 problems happen. One is that judges can't write down primary bank debt. The second is that multiple people can use the collateral for multiple loans. This causes a huge conflict on the servicer side. Okay? So ultimately, what happens is we have a system where the last readout, the ultimate reset button on the consumer's debt is broken. Now, this should have been fixed years ago. This would, within days, well, not within days, but it would put us on a sustainable path towards coming out of the foreclosure fraud crisis if ultimately our robust system of bankruptcy courts could be utilized towards fixing these problems. But they can't. This is a simple fix. It wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't fix it overnight, but it would at least get us on a path. Right now, we're just wandering. So interchange reform, I'm just going to kind of brush through it very quickly. It's a highly regressive system. This has been well documented by many studies. Poor people pay more in prices when they pay in cash, so rich people can get tax-free income on their credit cards. There's debate about how regressive it is, but it's certainly happening. So what reform was used? This was a bitter fight. What happened is that the Durbin Amendment basically said retail firms are now allowed to discriminate. They can say if you pay with a debit card versus a credit card, the credit card has a much higher fee, and it's driving all these fees, we can offer you a discount for the debit card. The Visa and MasterCard, set up their contracts so you could not do this, and they ultimately had the market power to do this. So what was the solution? The solution was to create a market. It was to allow individuals to take what was a block medium of exchange and split it in half and say, we get a choice. And through this choice, we can discipline abuses. We know it'll work because this is a classic fight of the top 1% versus the top 0.1%. Target's second highest line item is interchange fees. First one is labor. Target is well incentivized to carry out this regulation in a way that someone at the Federal Reserve never will be. Someone who will get lazy, someone will get bored, someone will forget the stakes. So by allowing individuals and allowing firms to hold the financial mediums of exchange accountable, we can see real reform. So in conclusion, when you think of this, it's always important to remember that the financial system should not be celebrated in and of itself. It's a medium of exchange that brings two people together. If we allow it to expand unchecked without simple but smart safeguards, it is likely to cause problems for both end users, both people who we ultimately are concerned about. And the opportunity to create markets, the opportunity to hold people accountable both through courts, both through lawsuits, both through simple disclosures, will always make everyone better off, simply as a result of the fact that that's what their job is to do in the first place. Thank you.
Clean up. I'm all between you and that sandwich, and your stomach's starting to rumble and grumble. So let's see if we can get there quickly. I'm, of course, going to talk about motherhood and apple pie, which will only make you hungrier. So first of all, thank you to New America, and especially for all of the contributions that Ellen Seidman has made. Welcome the chance to be here as well. So in the world of housing finance policy, we talk a lot about the goals of the policy being liquidity, stability, and affordability. And I really am pleased for this opportunity that Reed's provided to step back and think about why do we care about housing and why do we care about housing finance, whether it's rental housing or homeownership? What is the larger purpose of all of this? And it really is about a core notion of creating economic opportunity. It's the opportunity to get ahead, to provide a better life for your kids, all of that. And that, at its heart, means that you have to have a chance to invest in yourself and in your own lifestyle. And that may mean education, homeownership, chance to create a small business. Well, you can't do that if you're always at risk, if your sources of income could disappear. You can't invest in yourself and in things that might eventually pay off for you if you don't have some base level of stability. But on top of that base level of stability, you need access to the first rung of the ladder, so to speak. So the whole homeownership is part of, and I agree should not be the only part of, it's a small part of, a larger system that provides enough economic stability and access to the ladders by which all of us can try to get ahead to the extent of our means and abilities to produce a better life for ourselves. That's what's the core notion in America and what the financial system over the last decade wreaked havoc with. Now, some would argue that homeownership after the last decade is exactly the wrong thing for us to even to talk about anymore when you're talking about security and opportunity. We clearly became obsessed with it, and having to have the home media theater and the extra bonus room and all of those things were sort of natural entitlements. We also clearly caused people to have no diversification in their asset strategies. So take it as a given as I talk about homeownership that I believe that we need to have savings policies beyond housing, so people shouldn't only be invested in their home assets. We need to make sure that we have an appropriate balance between rental and homeownership, that there are some people who are ready for homeownership and some people who are not, and we need to be able to have, one of the reasons we don't have enough, we had so much access to homeownership because there wasn't sufficient affordable rental housing afforded to people at the incomes that they had, and that we need to make sure that, in fact, it's affordable enough so that people have some income available to save and invest in themselves over time. But I still want to say that at the end of the day, in a country where the home mortgage interest deduction is written into the Constitution, and if you try to suggest it's not, there's 535 members of Congress who would disagree with you. We may eventually trim it a little bit, but that's all we're going to do in my that's my prediction, that homeownership is going to continue to be an important aspect of savings, and so it's very important for us to think about how do we make sure that it is, access to it is equitable and it is safe. And it seems to me that's an important part of what we're trying to do going forward with housing policy. And I'm reminded in this always of the enormous gap in wealth between different parts of our society, particularly on racial lines. And obviously those gaps have been exacerbated by where the incidence of the stripping of equity has been through the homeownership crisis, where we have particularly, not exclusively by any means, but many communities of color which are suffering from the high concentrations of foreclosures, and that means everyone in the community seeing their home prices fall. So we had enormous wealth gaps by race before, historically, even as income gains closed some of those gaps. Wealth gains really have been stagnant over the decades, and now, if anything, we've further exacerbated that. So we're going to have communities, I talk about credit deserts. We're going to have communities where we're going to have lack of access to the system going forward as a result of this crisis, unless we affirmatively think about what we want to build in its place. And I just want to, actually I'll skip rental housing and come back to it later if we have time. So what is the housing finance system that we need to build? And this has been the work of this mortgage finance working group that is, and my views here are my own, but they reflect the benefit of thinking with about 20 of the country's leading housing finance experts, including Ellen and many others. And it seems to me that we've done a little bit of that work already. We need to have, if you think about it, a carrot and a stick. The carrot, in many ways, and the stick, we'll talk about first, is what we did initially. It's the Dodd-Frank Bill. There are some very important provisions there that will prevent some of the most abusive and predatory practices from coming back to us. And I'm not going to go through all of them. Obviously, probably in some ways the most important of which is the Cfpb, which we already talked about, because it has such broad authorities to oversee origination practices so that we're not stuck, as people innovate around whatever the ground rules are, we have the ability, if it's properly implemented, to respond. It also, there are many provisions that specifically originate the bad practices we had in the past, yield spread premiums, misstating borrow credit history, et cetera, and it incentivizes originating lenders to use best practices with the qualified residential mortgage definition, which is what is, if you meet that definition, access to the secondary market does not require large holdbacks of risk retention. One of the important things to note on that is that they did not decide when they did that to create a minimum down payment requirement. One of the things that I am very concerned about is that we've learned this lesson, that it is the access of the lack of a borrower skin in the game that caused the crisis. Now, to some extent, that's true. All studies show that the more equity people in the house, the more they work to protect it. But the reality is that that access to the investment capital that people can have to put down payments is very inequitably available in our society. And there are ways to mitigate the risk of inadequate down payment through counseling, through shared equity programs, through community programs where people have a sense of ownership in their house. So I was very pleased to see that Dodd-Frank did not include that provision, but I suspect as we go forward, we're going to see a lot more discussion about minimum down payments, and we should keep in mind this larger set of concerns. So if you think of Dodd-Frank, and there's lots more detail there, as the trying to get us to a safer, more sustainable set of products, including trying to create a level playing field at the secondary market where everyone has to retain risk, then the key kind of is what is the system we rebuild in the future? Today, 96% of all home mortgages are backed by the federal government, either in the form of Fannie, Freddie, or FHA. That means the entire federal housing market, everybody, people earning, who are buying $450,000 homes, $700,000 homes in some places, are essentially, in order to get an investor to lend you the money, the government is having to say that they're going to get paid back. Right? That's the most dramatic intervention and it was a necessary to macroeconomic stability, something we're not supposed to talk about. I learned on the last panel, but we're going to that's not a sustainable model. We have to replace it. So what's going to come in the future? Our working group has come up with a couple of key premises. The first is that we need to get rid of Fannie and Freddie, but create something in its place that will do some of the most important and essential functions, provide access to liquidity for housing by creating a broad pool of investors who don't have to do due diligence in particular loans, so there are these mortgage-backed securities that they can invest in. The entities that will issue these mortgage-backed securities, in order to have that broad pool of investors, do need a government guarantee. But now they're going to pay for it. That risk will be priced, and the government will collect that money, and they will
authorities of this new agency. And I think it'll be a really nice reference piece. Tim Fernholz, a fellow with us and at the American Prospect, has written that. Jonathan, at the local level, the terrain is changing also, and what kind of relationship are you expecting, information exchange that you could have with this new kind of entity? Or do you feel like you have the authority now to do some kind of full speed ahead on some initiatives on your own?
It's an interesting question from the city perspective because I think, as a lot of us know, I think you had described sort of an era of deregulation, and what that era of deregulation did in many ways was leave it to local government to exercise what authority they could. And so in New York, one of the opportunities that we've enjoyed is local regulation that can make a difference. And a couple of examples that I think are sort of clear on their face is we regulate, for example, debt collection. So any debt collector that wants to collect from a New Yorker has to literally be licensed by my department and has to follow a very stringent set of rules, not just around curtailing abusive behavior, but around proof of original debts being owed. We regulate employment agencies. We regulate even used car dealers. Politically untouchable at a federal level, apparently. But the ability to do that local regulation predates the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So ironically, one of the things from a city perspective that we wanted to be careful of as the regulation was wending its way toward passage was to make sure that in creating all of these federal powers, it didn't accidentally disrupt the local powers, which, as you pointed out, really do need to work hand in hand. At some level, it's about boots on the ground.
Right.
And it's one thing to have great policies, it's one thing to have great regulations, but at some point, if you don't see and you're not able to respond to what's literally happening and being able to figure out, I think Professor Warren refers to the tricks and traps, what's next, then you're always going to be behind the curve of a profit motive sector that's going to be moving more quickly.
Yeah. Let me also ask, Jonathan mentioned, Mike mentioned an idea that I particularly like, this notion of cram downs and negotiating at the time of bankruptcy, the ability to revisit mortgage negotiations, having judges involved so that we prevent it from going forward. It's an idea that we've highlighted in some of our work in the publication that's in your packets. Can that be done at the local level? What are some of the impediments? And also kind of from a policy standpoint at the federal level, is that something that the housing finance system needs to address and weigh in on?
It definitely cannot be done at a local level, and I would just add from a policy perspective, I have concerns about it as well. I think that one of the purest, most beautiful parts of consumer protection is, at the end of the day, the ability to make a fair deal and to have consequences around the fairness of that deal. I think that there are significant destabilizations when contracts can be rewritten by others. So that's,
of course,
the advantages are obvious, but
oftentimes you have the actors around the table who are part of it. And part of the problem, I guess, is Mike was pointing out.
Well, that's not a cram down. You see a lot of local regulation, including in New York, that is structuring settlement conferences and trying to encourage those settlements.
I like that idea too. Yeah.
Well, and in fact, to do a little institutional branding for a second, CAP put together an analysis a few months ago of, at the time there were 4 state, we called them mandatory mediation, but they structure them differently, programs. Now there are 21, and we just I think it went out, or no, it's about to go out, a further analysis of the 21, what's working, what doesn't, how local states can design those programs. What that requires is that the lender come to the table with the borrower, lay out what their cases, and see if in those circumstances it would make better sense for everybody involved to avoid a foreclosure through a modification or not. And it's voluntary. Nobody has to make an agreement there, but that would be and the evidence suggests that actually it reduces court dockets, and it actually reduces the cost to lenders of their foreclosures. And so it's something that I think the federal government can do. The politics of the cram-down, whatever one thinks of its merits, were difficult before. I think they will only be more difficult now, notwithstanding the sort of, at the moment, the frenzy and the embarrassment of the robo-signing crisis. But I think forcing more of this kind of deterrent to foreclosure may be possible at the federal level.
Yeah, if we were going to get crammed down, we would have had to gotten it during TARP. Simply wasn't going to happen. It's actually, if you ever heard Dick Durbin say that the banks owned the place about the Senate, it was actually in response to the cram-down fight. However, I do find a lot of state initiatives very promising, including the stuff Cap is highlighting. And ultimately, the robo-signing fraud crisis will be played out at the state level through states' attorneys generals who are well incentivized to push against fraud in their states. So hopefully state-based initiatives can really take some of the bleeding off the housing market and foreclosures.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time, and we'll close the panel now. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Appreciate everybody.